Hello, and welcome to the Learning to Be Human podcast. My name is Christopher Linkenbach, and this podcast is all about learning to be human. It's about navigating this emotional experience. It's about making mistakes. It's about learning about our shame and our trauma and how we can process emotions in order to live our best lives and really step into the fullest power of who we can be. Now, today's going to be a little bit different. We're going to be doing kind of a little presentation style sort of experience of just understanding trauma. And I've never done something like this before in the podcast format. I've done a couple things with my coaching clients, but this is the first time I want to kind of just dive into it and just try it out with the podcast style. I know some of you might be driving, so make sure that you keep your eyes on the road, all right? But today we're going to start off with a quick quotation. This quotation comes from Stephanie S. Covington. I'd not heard of her before, but as I was doing a little bit of research and kind of picking the quote for today, I came across her, and she is an internationally recognized clinician, author, and lecturer. She's a pioneer in the fields of addiction, trauma, and recovery. And her quotation is, "Trauma is any stressor that occurs in a sudden and forceful way and is experienced as overwhelming." And with that, we can dive into our little discussion here today. So let's just also define trauma. A good way that I like to look about understanding trauma is anything that happens too quickly, too intensely, it happens too fast, too quick, it's too overwhelming. There's too much to process. And so our brains use protection mechanisms to essentially shut it off from us. And so we're going to be diving into a little bit of a exercise that my therapist, Dr. Robert Baer, actually showed me called the trauma tree. And the trauma tree is actually it's very popular in the psychology field, and it is a fantastic way to understand how trauma originates and basically how it manifests in our lives. And there are different forms of the trauma tree. I'm going to go to the most basic one that I know just for teaching purposes, and then we can kind of understand a little bit better. So here we have our trauma tree. And at our trauma tree, as we can see, we have these roots, and we have a nice little, we have why is this word not coming to me? It's not the stem. We have the trunk, we have the tree trunk, and then we have the leaves or the fruit that is created at the top. And so we're just going to set this guy aside for a little bit right now. We're just going to start working on our own trauma tree. And so with this, we're just going to start with a couple of roots that we may have. And so with this, because this is our trauma tree, we're going to talk about essentially 5 different traumas that come up in real life. And so with this, we have the first trauma. And the first trauma that we're going to be talking about is kind of the one that everybody thinks of when they think of trauma. And that is going to be abuse. Abuse is anything that happens in a way that can be damaging to an individual from another individual. Abuse can be physical, it can be mental, it can be spiritual, it can be emotional. Essentially, it's somehow exerting power over another individual and causing pain, whether that's emotional, spiritual, traumatic. Abuse could be obviously beating a child. Abuse could even be as simple as spanking a child. There's studies shown that hitting children actually does not help with their development. And emotional trauma could be, for instance, or emotional abuse could be gaslighting somebody. Spiritual abuse, same thing, just kind of taking over somebody's life. And then we have our next trauma, abandonment. Now, abandonment is a very interesting one. So abandonment could be something as significant as a father perhaps leaving the household at a very young age for the child. Abandonment could also even be, for instance, being left at a grocery store for a bit too long, and the child in that moment panicked and freaked out. And even just to preface this by saying that we as children do not have the intellectual understanding at that age to say, oh, my parents just let me at the grocery store, they'll be back. Or even if our father leaves us, oh, dad left because of his trauma and his problems and his inability to cope with the world. Not we take it onto ourselves of, oh my goodness, I must be bad, I'm gonna die, and we immediately go into this very freaked out state of fear because we are children. We are emotionally and physically dependent on our caretakers, and so it can be very easy for our nervous systems to get overwhelmed with something like this. And so our next trauma is enmeshment. Now, enmeshment might be a new word to some of you. Enmeshment basically is a trauma in which the child is forced to grow up too quickly. It is an unhealthy relationship with the parent in some way. The child may have been in a position to have been forced to take care of the parent, whether that parent perhaps wasn't emotionally able to comfort themselves and started seeking their child for emotional comfort. If one of the parents was abusing the other one, for instance, if the father was abusing the mother and then the mother was going to the child for her needs, whether they be physical or emotional, as opposed to seeking that through a healthy relationship, the child is forced to grow up and start to take care of the mother. This could also come in the form of, for instance, a father telling a child too soon about some strange sexual history with himself or with the mother as well. And in that moment, the child is forced to grow up, and the enmeshment wound kind of begins with the child then having to hold the parent in some way before the child is emotionally capable of doing so, and causing the child to grow up too quickly. Also, why don't I spell it correctly? There we go. And then we have neglect. So neglect is also an interesting one. And neglect can come in the form of, with all of these, they can come in the form of big T trauma or little t trauma. So neglect could be in the form of not having your needs met as a child, right? And so neglect could be as serious as not having food made for the child, not having enough sustenance to actually get through the day. Neglect could come in the form of just the child not having any emotional experience with their family and just being in their room all day. Neglect could be just being not taken care of at all whatsoever, not getting their emotional or physical needs met in a healthy and sustainable way in a timely manner. And with the lower T trauma, neglect could also be something as simple as a mother turning her gaze away from the child before the child, while the child is crying out for hunger. So let me rephrase that. If the child is extremely hungry and he starts calling out to mom, and mom's right there and mom's not doing anything about it because she might be just exhausted, she just needs a break, and the child thinks, oh my God, mom's not going to feed me, immediately the brain goes to, oh my God, I'm going to die. And it gets overwhelmed with this fear of death. And in that moment, it takes on that neglect, which is then a trauma. And then from that trauma, then becomes embedded with an idea that in some way I'm not important enough to be taken care of. And that is where the trauma gets stored in the message. And then our last one here, critical incidents. So a critical incident is something that happens in the life, for instance, car crashes, concussions, major surgeries, something that happens to the body that causes physical trauma to the body. There's a lot of trauma that is then stored in the brain and then is then taken. It takes a while for the individual to heal, but then also what can happen down the line with even just concussions in children. And that's why it's so important during sporting events that children only have a certain amount of concussions before they're removed from the events because of the long-term damage that these critical events can cause. And so with all of that, we now get to the trunk. I said it that time, the trunk of the tree. And before I get into that, I want to just reemphasize the fact that all of these abuse, abandonment, enmeshment, neglect, critical incidents, they can have big T trauma, which is like serious trauma, sexual, physical abuse, extreme neglect, not being taken care of as a child, having parents who are drug addicts or alcoholics and getting beaten or not being taken care of in a proper way, having parents do extremely inappropriate things to the child. And it can also be little t trauma of just like these little sort of incidents that happen that the body's just unable to process for whatever reason. And because our childlike brains just weren't mature enough yet to understand the intellectual understanding of what was happening to us in that moment, they then take on trauma in some way. And so all of these traumas then create our friend shame. Now, shame is such a fun emotion. Shame is an emotion of hiding. Shame is the emotion of not feeling like we're good enough. Shame is the emotion of not being important. Ultimately, shame is the emotion of not feeling like we're good enough to be loved. And the sad thing about that is that we are already love. And so when we are shamed to the core, we are shamed in such a way that we are shamed from that of which we already are. And so we keep ourselves from ourselves in these incidents of shame. And this all stems from our traumas down here. So we carry the shame through our life. And then how does this shame manifest itself? How does this shame come about creating itself in our lives? So we're going to pull out sort of the root, the manifestation of what happens with shame. So at the end, the fruit of shame, we're just going to start pulling up a couple ideas. So the shame comes from the trauma, which is all down here, sort of in the root of the nervous system. And the shame manifests itself as, for instance, I'm just going to pull up a couple here. So we're just going to go divorce, not being able to navigate emotional relationships in a proper way. It comes in the form of addiction, finding ways to cope with the feelings inside of ourselves through food, through drugs, through alcohol. It comes in the form of suicide. Not being able to cope with our feelings could lead us to some pretty intense thoughts about ourselves, and ultimately to the fact of killing ourselves. It could lead to depression. It could lead to anxiety. It could lead to denial, very common for the individuals who have been abused to deny that they've even been abused in the first place out of protection of their own self-interest and needs. Anger is a big one. Anger is a human emotion. All of us have anger inside of us, and a lot of us say, oh, I'm a nice boy, I'm a nice little girl. I don't really get angry very often, but in there is some anger. There's anger in there. There's things that have happened to you that are not okay. And there's a part of you that is not happy about that. Codependency. That is a fun one that I'm very familiar with, as I am definitely a recovering codependent myself. Alrighty, other big ones, anxiety. We got anxiety. So those are kind of the main ones that I've got pulled up here. And these essentially manifest themselves as the fruits of our labor here. This is a fruit of our trauma tree. So with all of that, we have our whole trauma tree here. And we're just going to make that transparency go down just a little bit. So, as you can see, we have our fruits of what happens to us when we navigate our lives and we end up getting trauma in some way. And so with that, we can now see that the root of a lot of these things, so if you have anxiety, if you have depression, if you have denial, if you've had suicidal thoughts, if you've had If you're dealing with addiction, if you have some kind of codependency, then you can see, oh, look at that. It's because I have shame inside of me. And then from this shame, we then say, where did the shame come from? Why do I have this feeling of not being good enough? Why is there always this feeling of lack, or this feeling that in some way I'm not whole or complete as I am? Why do I feel that I'm not good enough for love? Why do I keep ending up in these same toxic relationships? Why am I constantly on edge when it comes to my day-to-day life, even though I'm completely safe and getting all my needs met? Why do I have these uncomfortable outbursts that happen every once in a while inside of my body? Just all these fun little emotions. But a lot of this, all of this stems from trauma. And so the way we go about working that is we see the manifestations in our lives of the divorce, the anxiety, the depression, the anger, and then we turn inward and we go, okay, what's going on? Obviously, I'm the problem. I'm creating this situation. Or perhaps we continue with our patterns until eventually we hit a breaking point again. And then we recognize that we have these uncomfortable emotions inside of us. And then we go down to the traumas. And then we relive the trauma to help bring it to the surface, to heal and to process. And there's a bunch of different modalities about doing that. It could be going to a therapist. It could be working with plant medicine. It could be going to a retreat, a psychodrama retreat, where they focus on tapping back into trauma. It could be going through breath work. It could be all of these coupled with each other. And I think that a fantastic way is kind of to just pick a couple, but also make sure that you have a therapist or someone who's able to guide you through this process as well as you're going through this, someone to kind of bounce and reverberate your ideas off of what's happening inside of you, because that being held and being seen is so healing in that process. And so with that, ladies and gentlemen, I just want to say thank you so much. This is the Trauma Tree. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out. My information will be down in the link below, and I will catch you guys in the next one, right? Peace.